Aloha. Welcome to Abe Lee Seminars Sessions. This chapter is going to be very interesting because what happens here, we're going to talk about something that is very unusual in Hawaii, but you don't see on the mainland. And that's what we call leasehold properties. You go, okay, what's the difference? Well, most people, when they buy properties, they buy it and they own it. And that's called fee simple. But in Hawaii, we have a whole bunch of large landowners like Bishop Estate and Campbell Estate and other large landowners that don't sell their land, but they'll lease their land. And so what happens in those cases? So let's say someone is a developer back in the 1960s and says, I would like to buy this chunk of land in the Moilili area, and let's say it's about 100,000 square feet of land. So the developer looks up who the owner is, calls him up, and let's say it's Bishop Estate. So the developer will call Bishop Estate land manager and say, I'd like to buy the property in Moilili at this location. Would you be willing to sell it? And typically what the large landowners will say, we don't sell the land, but we could do a long-term lease. And the developer goes, why a long-term lease? Because we don't sell the land, but we will lease it to you. And it typically is what we call a 55-year lease. And so the first 25 years might be fixed rent period, and they'll have a set rate per square foot. Then they have 30 years left, and they're going to reevaluate the value of the property per square feet, and then recalculate the ground lease rent. So let's take an example. 60, 70 years ago, let's say the land was $5 a square foot, and you had 100,000 square feet. So the value of the land was $500,000. Well then, if they charge 8% of the value of that land, then it would be $500,000 times 8%, that'd be $40,000 a year. If you divide it by 12 months, then it's a lot less. So that's how they determine what the ground lease rent would be for the next 25 years. And then on the 26th year, they appraise the value of the property, and then they will do the 8% on the value of the property and determine the ground lease for the next 10 years, what we call a fixed period. So let's say the land value went up to $50 a square foot. Then now the land is worth a lot more. That means that your rent would be 10 times more because it was $5 a square foot, but now it's worth $50. And today it could be $150, $200 a square foot. So the lease rents went up during that renegotiation period. And that's how a lot of properties were developed. A lot of land that the large landowners owned, they didn't sell the fee. They rented the building on what they call a ground lease. Very unusual from the mainland. Well, after 20, 30 years, the landowners would say, okay, it's time to renegotiate. And then the tenants would say, wait a minute, you're going to now increase my land lease by 10 times or 20 times? We can't afford it. In fact, your monthly payments for the lease rent is more than my mortgage. So the lessees, the apartment owners or the house owners that were on leased land went to the legislature and said, you know what? We can't afford these higher lease rents. You got to do something about it. Can you force the landowners to sell the fee? And the government said, you know what? We can do what they call eminent domain, condemn the land for public good, not public use, and will force the landowners to sell. So they passed some laws that had the mandatory condemnation law for leasehold properties. The landowners obviously didn't want to do that, so they went to court and sued, and they lost. Because for public good, the government agreed that for the good of the public, the landowners should be able to be forced to sell their land, and then the owners should be able to buy their little chunk of land for a condominium, a high-rise, or a single-family home. For the landowners, when they were condemned, they could take that proceeds from the sale and exchange into something else. So a lot of these landowners, they went from residential land that could have the condemnation law affect them and went to commercial properties because they don't have condemnation laws for public good because people are not living on commercial properties. And business owners are used to leases, but the homeowners are used to owning their land. Hence, we had the mandatory condemnation law that took place for a few decades. And then there was what they call a drop-dead date, a sunset date when the law expired. And I remember clearly when Mufi Hanneman was a mayor in Honolulu, and the law was about to die, basically expire. And he made a statement saying, the law has done its job. We've converted most of the leasehold properties to fee simple, so I'm not asking the city council to extend that mandatory condemnation. So now it is voluntary conversion, not mandatory conversion. There are still some leasehold land that's very valuable that will not ever be sold in fee because the landowners are not willing to sell the fee. And they will continue to keep it until the lease is over. And then what happens? Well, if the lease is over, the lessees have to pack up their goods, what we call the personal properties like the furniture, the bedding or appliances, and say goodbye to their unit. And they basically have to close the door and they've lost their apartment or their house. We have a few buildings that have gone through the process where the lease ended and the people had to leave. Well, that's the bad side of leasehold. But they've had that use for 55 years on a ground lease. And that's what they call the leasehold properties. So we find a very interesting part of Hawaii history in leased land going from fee simple by the major landowners or even smaller landowners. And when the lease is up, the lessees have to leave. But because of the condemnation law, they're able to convert most of that leasehold land to fee simple. So we don't have too many leasehold land anymore in residential properties. In commercial properties, we still see a lot of leased land, but not in residential. So the government stepped in to help the lessees. And that was a good thing for most people. Otherwise, after 55 years, they'd have to give up and they'd have to say goodbye. And basically, they could become homeless or have to move in with their children. So some proponents of the law did it because they had to have a home that they could eventually call their own, not under leasehold, but under fee simple. Hope this explains what happened historically to the leasehold lands that became fee. Aloha.